CKUT 90.3 FM in Montreal. It's just after 11 o'clock, 11:10 here on this Wednesday morning. This is Free City Radio. I'm really happy to join you. I'm your host, Stefan Christoff. We started the program with a piece by the Dirty Three from their album Horror Stories. The piece we heard is called Hope. We're now going to go to a very important story, an underreported story, which is the case of Egyptian-Canadian Khalid El-Kassaz, who has been blocked from returning to Canada. And there's a very important support campaign taking place for Khalid out of Toronto. And I'm going to be joining one of the members of that support committee. This case really fundamentally illustrating the dangers today faced in the authoritarian political context of Egypt under the military regime of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. So we are joined on the line by Ahmad Attia from Toronto. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
So, to start, can you please just give us a breakdown of Khalid's case for people who aren't aware? What are the critical points, and why should people tune in?
Well, Khalid and Sarah are both, Sarah was born in Mississauga, Ontario, and their 4 children are born in Canada. Khalid and Sarah are both graduates of U of T and have contributed a lot to Canada prior to choosing to go to Egypt around 2005 to start a educational project there, where they're hoping to help change the educational model in Egypt to reflect more of the the values and approaches that are used in Canada. And so they spent years doing some activism work there in Egypt and that project. And post-revolution, they got active. The world celebrated the revolution in Egypt. It was an amazing time for everyone. Canada celebrated, and Canadians and everyone across the world.
The end of the regime of Hosni Mubarak.
That's correct. And just the idea of, Egyptians having a freedom of expression and this transition to democracy. And for most Egyptians, they never really knew what that meant. They never experienced the freedoms that we as Canadians know and we enjoy every day of our lives. But Khalid and Sarah did. And so, it meant, this revolution meant something different for them because they knew what the potential of it could be. Because of the lives they lived in Canada, and Khalid was he was a leader in a true sense, and he was very vibrant, and very skilled, and so he was invited to join as a staffer in the presidency in the new government post-revolution in Egypt. He owned the file of human rights and women's rights, and he was also the liaison with foreign affairs and embassies in Egypt, and so he was helping change the context of human rights in Egypt at the time. When the military coup happened, that night he was detained with 9 other staffers and advisors with President Morsi, and that was the last moment that Sarah and her children had seen him. In fact, it was his birthday on July 3rd, and his children were waiting at home with the cake and the gifts, and he never came home. For 5 months, he was detained incommunicado. No one knew anything about him. We didn't know he was alive. Sarah returned to Canada to start a campaign here because, Khalid was someone who was well-respected. Thousands of Canadians spoke out, sent petitions. It was a huge campaign, and Sarah carried this campaign for 2 years, until the Egyptian prosecutor general demanded or issued a decision to release Khalid in January of this year. And he was, in those 2 years where he was held in solitary confinement, he was never charged, he was never put on a trial. He was held arbitrarily from day one up until the day he was released. But today, 10 months after his release, he's still being held in Egypt and not allowed to travel. And so while he's out of the jail that he was in, he's in a larger jail, being held within the borders of Egypt. In fact, Sarah and the children traveled to see him right after he was released, thinking they would bring him home after 2 weeks. and we're all shocked to still find ourselves campaigning 10 months later, trying to get Khalid, Sarah, and the children out of the country. In fact, the whole family right now is being prevented from leaving Egypt. And so this is kind of the quick storyline of what happened. And this is a very important case for Canada, and so we're trying to share it with all Canadians.
So just for a bit of context, if we could just backtrack a bit, you mentioned that Khalid had moved to Egypt, was very involved in work around education reform. I had read on this also, and along with his partner, Sarah. And after the first democratic election of Mohamed Morsi, after the fall of the Hosni Mubarak regime, eventually that government was toppled, as you mentioned, by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the military administration. Can you just walk us through a bit of the context of the Sisi government and the complicity or the support of Western countries, and also what is happening in Egypt in regards to political prisoners, because Khalid's case is, of course, one of many.
So Khalid was the first political prisoner after the military coup. The military coup, although Western countries do not use that term, it is what it is. Most Western countries look at it as a transition to democracy, and we hope that it can eventually become that, and eventually, Egypt can witness or return back to the revolution that was started, and they can achieve the democracy that they wanted. And this is the right of every Egyptian person. But the Western countries have been accepting of the current government, and more importantly, they've been looking in the other direction when it comes to the human rights violations that the current government the violations they've done. There are over 40,000 detainees in Egyptian prisons that include young children, seniors, and anyone who's opposing this government or speaking out. But these are fundamentally human rights cases, and Khalid is a highlight of that. Khalid's case is not a political case. It's an individual who was a victim of arbitrary detainment, enforced disappearance, kidnapping, torture, solitary confinement, no access to legal counsel, no access to what his accusations were, until he was released. And so while we're thankful that he's currently out of jail, there are 40,000 people who are experiencing what Khalid went through. And so there is a human rights crisis in Egypt. In fact, yesterday, Sarah Lee Whitson was speaking at Ryerson University about Egypt, and she was explaining that, every country, most Western countries, have many of their own nationals who have been victims of the abuse or the human rights violations of this current government, including Canada. There was Mohamed Fahmy, there's Khalid al-Qazzaz. And so, Canada has been very friendly to the current government in Egypt, and while it has Canadian citizens who have been victims to the human rights violations of that country.
So just a point of detail. So Khalid was arrested and jailed for quite some period of time without charge?
Khalid was in solitary confinement for just over a year. Prior to that year, he was in an undisclosed location where we knew nothing about him for 5 months. So about for a year and a half, Khalid was held in custody without ever being charged or offered accusations. In fact, the United Nations issued an opinion and a follow-up to that opinion that this is arbitrary, specifically about Khalid, and that the Egyptian government, as a state member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, were called on to release Khalid immediately and unconditionally and compensate him for the time that he was held in violation of international law.
So can you explain for our listeners also what this means for the family of Khalid, his partner Sarah, their children. I mean, I can imagine this is a devastating situation, and also one that reflects the experience of many of the other thousands of political prisoners in Egypt today that you mentioned.
On July 3rd, 2013, Sarah became a single mother with 4 children. Her youngest daughter, who was just recently born at the time, had never really known her father, didn't really know her father. And Sarah had to campaign, and she traveled the world advocating for her husband's release while taking care of her 4 children, who, were in Canada, and watched their mother fight for their father's freedom. This was a very difficult ordeal, and it continues to be so for our family. Sarah's my brother, Sarah's my sister, and Khalid's my brother-in-law. And the children have went through a lot of trauma. And in fact, when they went back to Egypt and they took Khalid and they went to the airport, they've attempted to travel twice. In the Cairo airport, they were detained for 7 hours each time and separated from their father. And this has caused psychological impacts on the children. The idea of losing their father again has been extremely traumatic for them. And so we have decided that Khalid and Sarah cannot try to travel again in fear of causing more impact on their children until the Canadian authorities completely get clearance and arrange for their safe exit and safe travel home.
So one final point I wanted to visit with you, if possible, is the responsibility of Canada in this case. So there is, of course, the new Liberal federal government. Prior to that, this past fall, we did see a lot of high-level meetings between the former Conservative government and the Egyptian military regime that is responsible for the detention and now the blocking of your brother's return to Canada. So there was meetings between the Foreign Affairs Minister at the time, John Baird. A lot of military contracts were signed between Canadian arms companies and the Egyptian military, a lot of high-level meetings. And one of the terms that the former Foreign Affairs Minister used was that Egypt, quote, is on a path towards democracy. So we haven't seen a lot of clear statements from the new Liberal government about the military government in Egypt. But I'm just wondering if you could highlight a bit the responsibility of Canada, its position under the current Liberal government and where it was at under the Conservatives.
So the Conservative government, to their credit, assisted us several times in raising the case with the Egyptian authorities. Whenever there was an opportunity, they raised the case on humanitarian grounds, and I have no doubt that they played a role. In addition to all the advocacy and the work that Sarah was doing, they played a role in finally resulting in the release of Khalid in January. However, it is a very slow role, and it never took such a long time to have him released, and also then did not result in actually, having him reunited safely with his family in Canada. And we hope that the Liberal government will continue to build on the diplomatic work that the previous former government had done. I continue to advocate that this is one of the this is a Canadian foreign affairs case. Sarah, her husband, 4 children, a Canadian family is being prevented from coming home to Canada, and so the Canadian government, like you said, has many bilateral relations with Egypt, many economic relations with Egypt, and has been very friendly to the current government in Egypt, and has not once ever criticized the government, unlike many other Western countries, has never once criticized this government for its human rights violations. And so all of that should come with weight and leverage that the current Canadian government should be able to say to Egypt that we want this family to be sent safely so they can move on and live and put all this work behind. We're hoping, we're meeting and piece of work welcomed us into their offices, and we're hoping that the Liberal government will expedite this issue, this foreign affairs issue, because it was an active file, and and deserves to be closed very quickly. And frankly, the Canadian government is responsible for the safety of this family, so they need to ensure. And there's instability in Egypt, where it's very scary. We're concerned about their safety, and so the sooner they get here, the sooner we can put this behind us.
Thanks so much for outlining your thoughts on your brother-in-law's case. We wish you the best. Also, can you maybe share with us a place people can go online for some more information?
Sure. So we have our website. It's free, Free, Khaled, Khaled, Al-Kazzaz, Alqazzaz. So freekhaledalkazzaz.com. And you can also, we have a website we've created called emailyourmp.ca. And when you go there, you can just put your name, your postal code, and you can, there's a default letter, and hit email, and the website will figure out who your MP is and send them an email that you're concerned and you'd like your MP to take action. And so that's a great way you can help us out.
Okay. Ahmed, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Ahmad Attia, who is the brother-in-law of Khaled El-Kazzaz, who is an Egyptian-Canadian in Egypt today with his family, blocked from returning to Canada, and was a political prisoner held without trial or charge under the military regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt. And we do encourage people to check out this case and follow it. We will be providing some updates on the show as things evolve. And the name again is Khaled El-Kazzaz, and you can find it online. We will be posting links on our website, freecityradio.org. So that does it for our program this week. Thank you so much for joining us. We do have a community announcement, and we'll play also an excerpt from a piece by the Dirty Three out of Melbourne, Australia, trio. And do stay tuned for XX Files, which will be at 11:30. It's been a pleasure being with you this morning. I'm Stefan Christoff. Do stay tuned for CKUT 90.3 FM.